begin recording and then do a little bit of an introduction. So, good morning, everybody. We are really happy to have Margaret Seidler here, who's a native Charlestonian. She's provided the consulting leadership for the Charleston Illumination Project when it started up a couple of years ago. She'd been working with Police Chief Greg Mullen on a polarity-based strategic planning process. She's a nationally recognized organization development consultant, master trainer, and author, whose practice focuses on creating higher performance in organization and community systems. Central to her work is polarity thinking, a set of principles and methods to help people see, map, and tap the power of both and thinking for better, more sustainable results, hence her interest in Charleston policing. Since coming back to her hometown of Charleston and establishing consulting practice in 2001, she's published numerous articles and a book called Power Surge that came out from the Human Resource Development Press of Amherst, Massachusetts in 2008. She's now, I think, happily retired and living just off St. Andrews Boulevard. And she's here today to talk about something not remotely really related to her professional life, but this is the research that she's been doing into her family ancestry, which I hope everybody has read about in the post that we had. So Margaret, we're thrilled to have you here today, and it'll be over to you.
Can everyone see the slide?
That's good, yes.
So thank you again for having me, and it's great to see some friendly faces in the audience. And you're absolutely correct that I was never interested in history or genealogy. Having been born here in 1952, I grew up right next door to McLeod Plantation that's pictured here on the right. I grew up there. I lived there till 1970 when I went off to the University of South Carolina. And just to know that my experience here was one of seeing the Black families living in these cabins and going out to the cistern that you'll see right here in the center and enjoying their water. They never had electricity to the cabins. They were just living in a very different mode than I, who lived on a golf course in the country club of Charleston. So it was a very different experience. I was so surrounded by all this that I really wasn't particularly curious about it. And so I call myself the accidental historian, and it's about family history that was lost to my family from 1758 to 1859. So I've gone from family history lost to having research with a very personal purpose. And just know that all my life, I believed that I was fifth generation Charlestonian. This is my grandmother, Marie, which was a French pronunciation, Marie Gruber Dandridge, and she was born here in 1882 and died in 1983. And that if you don't recognize me, that's me when I was 19 and I was home from college for Easter. And I will tell you, I adored this woman. She was my best friend. I loved her. And her story about our family was that we grew up on Blake Street, which is just the north side of the cigar factory in the east side, and that we were from poor German immigrants who came, I thought, in the 1850s. My grandmother, Bama, she graduated from the 8th grade. Her husband graduated from the 3rd grade. So that was my belief my entire life, that was who I was from. And it wasn't until 2018 that I revisited a DNA test that I had taken sometime earlier and really dug into it. And I found out that I actually had DNA cousins who are of African descent, and likely my 6th great grandparent, and I'm going to assume grandmother, was 100% West African. So I talked to my African-American cousins and they said, Margaret, if you know anything about your Charleston family, if you would be willing to research it for us, we can literally learn about our ancestry going right along with you on your journey. Otherwise, we can't go past 1865. And I'll tell you, it was a pivotal, defining moment in my life to do something for people who couldn't do it without me. So all of a sudden, I went from not being interested to being on a mission. So I had recalled that in 1983, when my grandmother died, I had an older cousin she's deceased now too. And she made some copies she found the Gruber's family Bible, and she made some copies. And this is actually my grandmother's handwriting about our ancestors. And I had recalled this vaguely. And most of these people were all from New York. And I thought, well, why would I be interested in anybody from New York? I'm from Charleston. These are just outsiders, right? These are people I would have no reason to even get to know. And so I looked up these people on the internet, and this one name that I'm pointing down here, John Torrance, was one that popped up on the internet immediately, not from New York or previously from New York. He was really living in Charleston, South Carolina. And so it was Easter morning. My husband and I were attending Mount Zion AME Church on Glebe Street. We came back from sunrise service, and this is what I happened to find on the internet that morning. It says John Torrance, and this is the correct spelling. John Torrance was a partner in the firm Torrance, Gregg & Pogue. The firm was responsible for bringing a number of Huguenots in 1764 to Charleston from England, and hundreds of slaves to Charleston from Africa. And I will tell you that I was shocked. My mother never knew that we had other family here in Charleston. My grandmother, I don't believe, knew either. I don't think it was talked about. So here I not only thought that I had been, because I wasn't a blue blood name here, I thought I had been exempt from the stain of slavery, when instead I had a fifth great grandfather who was in fact importing enslaved people from Africa. And I mean, I was shocked. As I began to research this John Torrance, I found out that he was a member of Circular Congregational Church, that he got here in 1758, and that he was a British loyalist. I went to Grace Episcopal Church growing up. I had no idea that I had family that were from the Circular Church. And ironically, I worked across the street at South Carolina Electric and Gas for 8 years, directly across from this grave, which is right on Meeting Street, walking right past an entire passel of my ancestors, having no idea they were buried there. So who is John Torrance? Born in 1702 in Derry, Ireland, which is now Londonderry. My husband Bob and I went there last year, and we were unsuccessful in tracing much of that family past 1702. He comes to New York City in the mid 1750s to work with a man who I think was not very moral, Waddell Cunningham, who came from Belfast. The two of them, during the French and Indian War that we had, that the colonies had, Cunningham and Torrance used their own ships to supply the enemy. So what I learned, and what international genealogists have told me, is that Torrance and Gregg and Pogue and Cunningham were some of the earliest industrialists in the United States. These were merchants, these were capitalists, these were people out to make a buck. While Torrance is in New York City, he marries well to Elizabeth Blanche Smith, who was the daughter of New York's Judge William Smith. They head to Charleston in 58 to expand their market from New York into Charleston, because this was such an opportunity and a becoming bustling business. So he owns ships and acts as agents to bring French, many Irish and Scottish, then Africans, in the transatlantic slave trade between 1760 to 1775. He dies in Charleston in 1708 on the eve of the siege of Charleston by the British. Excuse me just a second. Bob, can you get Tommy? My cat is crying. I'm so sorry. So I continued the research beyond Torrance to find out about he's over at this door, to find out about what else my grandmother hadn't told me. So I went to Magnolia Cemetery, where my grandmother is buried. And I found that there were many other there. I'm getting feedback somewhere.
Yeah, please, if you're online as an audience member, please mute yourself.
And so I went to Magnolia Cemetery, and there were many groupers buried there, as well as a whole other group called Payne, P-A-Y-N-E. So I started going back to a more recent set of ancestors. So I found out that John Torran's daughter married William Payne, and he came to Charleston in about 1786. He was not from a wealthy family. He was the son of servants to a very wealthy family in Ireland called the Butlers. And the Butlers were related to Pierce Butler, who's one of our constitutional founding fathers, who has been mostly forgotten in Charleston. And he's the one who passed the Fugitive Slave Act clause in the Constitution, as well as the 3/5 representation rule. Butler gave William Payne his start in Charleston as a clerk. And what happened soon after that was Payne and Pierce Butler's nephew, Edward, got in trouble. And here's a quote. He said that Payne was an Irishman well-versed in hypocrisy and falsehood, that he was ever the scoundrel. That Butler also wrote that the allurements and dissipations in Charleston proved too much for both of them. They both wanted to be rich at once. So make no mistake about it. People were coming to Charleston from all over Europe to make money, This is just an example, a source document that came from the letter book of Pierce Butler, writing more about what he thought, how bad he thought William Payne and his nephew were. So what I want to talk about going forward may be difficult for some of you. It was difficult for me. It's gotten a little easier to talk about. And this is the truth that when I presented 2 weeks ago to the Charleston Tour Guide Association, the 40 tour guides who attended did not know any of this historical research. I brought new research of the story to be told in Charleston, and I think the time is absolutely right to do so. So William Payne was a broker auctioneer and also called a vendue master, all synonymous. Today, he might be called a real estate broker. He started in the late 1700s with a small retail store. And in 1802, he went bankrupt, and he found a more lucrative line of business, and that is the domestic slave trade. This is not transatlantic. These are people who lived here, lived in Charleston. They did not come off a ship. These are people who lived all over the city and the surrounding areas. So what I've done is I've spent about 250 hours just on William Payne. This is not Torrens or anybody else. This is just on the ads that you're going to see in a few minutes, researching local newspaper ads online at the Charleston County Public Library, also using the Historical Society as a resource and the South Carolina Linneana Library at USC. So this is a sample of the 28 Excel spreadsheets that I have that documents all the ads that I found where William Payne was selling something. So the left-hand column is where the actual sale took place, the date of the newspaper ad, who the company was. This is William Payne and Son in 1819. You can see he sold 886 people that year. In this next column, this is the number of people listed in the ad, and then any kind of specific description. So 100 people were in this ad. The ad below is 80 additional people. And this was the estate of William Dowdy. Everybody knows Dowdy Street, right? By Roper Hospital. And most of these in here were country born. If they had their occupations, I listed that. Down here, if they listed the enslaved people's names, I listed that. I want people to be able to use this as a way to research their families of African descent or their white families as well. So I've got estate names, I've got the enslaved people's names, and I have in the research, over 1,100 ads documented. One of the most public ones and famous sales that William Payne and his sons auctions that he conducted was for the estate of John Ball. And all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Slaves in the Family that came out by Edward Ball in the late 1990s. I know I read it in the 1990s and learned so much that I didn't know about my hometown. So basically, in this ad, there are actually 367 Negroes sold from about 6 different plantation sites of John Ball's. Tony Carrier with the International African American Museum found the bill of sale the invoice from William Payne to John Ball's estate, and his commission for the 2-day event in 1819 was a little over $3,000. And that would be the equivalent of his company making $63,000 in 2020 dollars, which means that the total value of the estate of just people who were sold that day is in excess of today's dollars of $6.3 million. And if you want to read more about that particular plantation and their sales, there's a book, Sale and Separation, that you can read, Working Towards Freedom. So what I've done is I've chronicled William Payne's business and his career, and I call it Painful Business. And what is here is the ad year that I documented. None of this is anecdotal. This is all documented sources. The number of people sold. So both columns all the way from 1796 to 1833 when William Payne died. So you can see that he had some banner years, say in 1816, he sold 1,118 people. In total, he sold in his career, he and his sons, John, William, and Josiah, sold 9,217 local enslaved people in their career. These are not duplicated. If anything, it is a low number because it is really hard to find the ads. And these people were sold through estate sales, mortgage debts, and tax liens with the county sheriff's office, all local people. Hypocritically, in 1810, William Payne and Charles Coatsworth Pinckney, who was another founder of our Constitution, founded the Charleston chapter of the Bible Society. Payne was their first treasurer, Pinckney was their first president, and their purpose was to distribute Bibles, and they did that all the while brokering the sale of humans. I'll go through the ads. This is a city sheriff's ad from 1812. I just want to show that I've got the documentation where William Payne and Sons actually was acting on behalf of the city of Charleston and the city sheriff. This was business. This was nothing more than business. This was about making money. We've got this ad in 1810 where Negroes can be exchanged as cash. So Negroes, the same as cash. This is one, a lot on Harleston Green. And you can either have Negroes taken in exchange or part cash and part Negroes. You can also sell or rent enslaved people. And this is an ad that I found from 1820 in a book by Larry Koger, K-O-G-E-R, who I just ran into a few weeks ago, a book that he has called Black Slave Owners in Charleston. The rationale behind offering the option to rent enslaved people was it was a way to bring in poorer whites or free people of color into the overall economy of enslavement so that everybody would have a stake in it and be less likely to try and abolish it. These enslaved people, it just amazed me how highly skilled these are. I didn't even know what a patroon was. This was a fellow who was being sold in 1804 who absolutely knew how to navigate the creeks and the rivers of Charleston, the sandbars. I mean, you think about it, if you've ever been sailing around here, you better know where the channel runs. Another thing that stood out to me was how families were sold together. And I was like so excited. I said, oh boy, at least these white people, these merchants had a heart and they wanted to keep families intact. And what I found out later was that it was because keeping families together would reduce the number of runaways. And I've got more ads I won't show you today. Just know that the runaway ads were amazing. They were there every day. This is a very chaotic system, a business system to try and manage. So this is one where we got a valuable family of servants. We've got a young carpenter. We got a boy who's 15. We got a wench who's 21. We got a girl 16. And we got an old woman who is the grandmother to these other two generations. This one just stood out to me. It hit me in the gut. The young wench, a cook and a washer with her two children, one a fine boy of about 5 years old, the other in the arms. Exactly, runaways. They were rampant. A single day of runaway ads, one single day. I mean, imagine the chaos. And what I've come to realize is that these human beings were literally, not figuratively, literally treated as property. So here's one ad. The following property for sale. Belonging to the state of Dr. Benjamin St. Mark's, deceased. He has an aged Negro man, a young Negro man, 2 guns, a watch, a harness, 610 and 6 tablespoons, a pair of shoe buckles, and a pencil case of silver. This was marketing. These ads that William Payne and his family, my family, his sons, put in the paper were to try and get top dollar for this property. So if you'll notice in this, we've got David. He's a first-rate painter. He can actually bring you in some money if you buy him. We have Archie, who's very orderly. He's a laborer and he's very orderly. We have Jim, who is we got Jim, who's accustomed to work, and I can't read what that says. Sally's a first-rate cook. She's got her 2 sons. They are accustomed to housework, so that means they can work in town. Mary, who's excellent seamstress and a house servant, and she's got 2 children. That makes her even more valuable because they'll grow up and they will make money for you. Lucy, a good cook and a market woman. That means she can go to the market for you, or actually she can represent you in the market. We've got a first-rate nurse. These people were skilled. This one I will let speak for itself. Small boys, which will be sold singly. These are ads where I'm actually demonstrating that the enslaved were sold in the business and residence of William Payne at what was then in 1828, number 28 Broad Street. What I have, and this one proves that what I have learned is, and Doreen Larimer has helped me, she's a deeds researcher here in Charleston, she's amazing, is that 28 Broad then is now 32 Broad. And Nick Butler, who's a historian with the library, said, I said, well, how could they have these people to be seen and in this place on Broad Street inside the building? Is they likely had a holding pen on the first floor and the residents were above. So 34 Broad, 32 and 34 Broad is all one building now. It became later Germania Savings Bank, and that building and 32 Broad are both torn down. And this is what it looks like today. It was First Federal from 1963 when they built this big white building. And now it's South State Bank. And it's owned by a company that is located in here in Charleston from Virginia. And so what's important here is that what I have documented is what my family, what they did in terms of sales at 28 Broad. After William Payne died, his sons rented the space and later sold it to some other domestic slave traders. What I have here on the right are all the other slave traders in that period that I have come across. And I will tell you, the Payne family is second to none in the period of 1800 to 1833 in the number of enslaved people brokered. What I'm hoping is that other people in Charleston will become interested in spending the time that it takes to do this research to tell a more complete history of what Broad Street was really like. We know that enslaved people street sales were outlawed because there were just too many traffic jams in 1856, and the big abolitionist movement had started, and private sales continued was then 28 Broad with Bennett and Ratt. I've got the ads that document it. places that you can find my research. If you want me to, I'm happy to email it to you. These are all these wonderful people that have supported me. Again, I did not know what I was doing or even getting into. What I'm working on right now is a historical marker at what is the big white building at, quote, the new 34 Broad. And I will say that last Thursday, the owners of the building gave their permission for a private plaque to be placed on their building. And I'm going before the City History Commission for their review and comment within a couple of weeks. So I am beyond myself. I have worked on this for months and months and months. So this is a more complete history of what can be revealed when you step out of disinterest and denial and find out really what part your family may have played in our past.
Thank you, Margaret. That's absolutely wonderful. That's a terrific presentation of your work. I was on a presentation on Tuesday with Julia Eichelberger and Bernie Powers, who's listed as one of your folks to go to. And I'd asked them both if there was one thing they'd like people to know about Charleston that they think people don't recognize, what would that be? And Julia said something very similar, I think, to what you've been discovering. She said she wanted people to understand just how extensive slave owning, slave trading was in Charleston and how all pervasive it was. And so I think you've done a wonderful job to explain that. So do we have questions? I didn't see anything in the chat, but I'm sure people must have questions. If you got a question, please just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask, or send me something in the chat.
I'll ask first.
Go for it.
Margaret, you started all this with talking about reaching out to your cousins and how they were so interested in their background. Have you shared this research with them? Have they offshot to different possibilities? What is the deep connection with the people who are still alive with this research?
So all of my first cousins on that side of the family, all my family in my generation is deceased except for me. So it's the next generation, their children, and they are 100% behind this and supporting me. And when we do the marker dedication, they're going to fly here. And I have found that a lot of people that I grew up with here in Charleston that I didn't know were my cousins are my cousins. And I would say by and large, they are, I haven't been shunned by them, but I have not been embraced because of the story that I'm revealing about their family. I have one cousin who lives out of state that I did, well, two cousins who live out of state that I didn't know about, and I've met them both now, and they are really excited about this truth being told. What's been interesting about this is I've actually lost some friends.
That's sad.
Case is lifelong.
Yeah. What basis do they give for cutting friendship with you, Margaret, exactly?
They can't answer the question why I might stir this up after all this time, that I didn't have anything to do with it. So why would I bring this up?
Right, interesting. So in the absence of anybody else asking questions, one thing that took me completely by surprise about 10, 15 years ago when we were trying to write a grant for digitizing some records of these things to try and make things a little bit more accessible for folks, because so much of this material is very difficult to find, as you've been demonstrating in your talk, right? So we wanted to try and get a lot of these things digitized. I discovered that there were actually slave mortgages. I had no idea that this was another way in which owning slaves could be a way of generating wealth, because you could actually mortgage a slave. And there are books and books of these things going back into the 18th century all the way through to the mid 19th century. And they're really chilling in some of their language, because you basically put a person up as collateral for money, for a loan, And they will nearly always, especially if they're women, will include the phrase "and the issue thereof." So, you know, you realize how incredibly lucrative this was, because you could own people as property. So they were a kind of material wealth. They would generate money for you by the work that they did. You could also use them for credit.
Yes.
Right. And if they reproduced, then they're actually creating more people to do the same thing for you. I mean, it's an extraordinary system, just economically.
Yes.
And Margaret, I think you're quite right. The idea of trying to suck as many people into that system by opening up renting and things like that is really just extraordinarily inhumane. And I don't think people really understand that about this. I think we just do, you know, by using the term slave rather than people. And I'm thrilled that you're saying, you know, this is the number of people the Paines sold. I think that's terribly important.
Well, what I've learned is I always thought that most of the people of African-American descent that were mulatto, what they would call mulatto back then, or part or whatever, I assumed a lot of that was from lust and rape. And so what I've learned is a lot of it was intentional, just what you said, Keith, that, you know, they would go have intercourse with an enslaved person or a enslaved woman to have more, make more money, have more hands. And I mean, I know that your church family is very committed to justice, and I don't know what kind of resources that you have within your church, financially or time yourself. If there's anybody who wants to research some of these other traders whose names I put on the screen, I will teach anybody who wants to support that effort, because this, I mean, I'm telling you, the Charleston Tour Guide Association did not know this. And I think it's going to take people like us to do that. And another thing that I'm doing, I'm working with this woman who is helping me. I've got some bills of sale from my family that I have found. And I met with her yesterday. She's actually helping me trace forward the ancestors of the enslaved people who were owned by the Gruber and Payne families. So I'm working on that right now. That'll be phase 3. Somebody in the chat asked, do I actually have African cousins? I have my African DNA cousins, and I did a shorter presentation today because of your time constraints. I've got it traced back to where we come from. Judge William Smith, my Black cousins and I come from Judge William Smith in New York, and we can trace it back to him and his children. In terms of that ancestor that is my direct African-American, my 0.1% of my DNA that's African descent, it's so far back I can't find it. And I don't know that I will.
Gail, do you want to ask your question too?
Sure. I was just, I hadn't thought about this idea of renting out slaves. And I know you've obviously got information on the ads, but were there other information? I'm just curious as to whether they were long-term rentals or mostly short-term. Were they rentals primarily for a specific project? I mean, there's just a wealth of information to.
Well, it was all over I think it's a great question. I think it was all over the board.
Yeah.
And there were some that would be day rentals. There would be some I saw you can rent them by the month.
Yeah. Gee.
And if you get Larry Koger's book, Black Slave Owners, he's got a lot of information in there about rentals. And just so you'll know, most of the Black slave, or many of the Black slave owners and this is in Charleston, not other places, in Charleston, were females, and they were buying their families. Not across the board. Many were buying their families. And my third great granduncle Josiah Payne sold a Black man, a free person of color named John Morris, Rosanna and Caroline in the 1850s. And those were his daughters that Josiah Payne owned. So I'm going to try and find their descendant or their descendants. Yeah. But listen, any way to make money,
Yeah, they did it.
Imagine. And if you want, you can go on YouTube, and I've got a longer presentation that I did to the Charleston Tour Association that may answer some of that a little bit better. Others? I'm curious, what did people feel when they saw what I just presented? I think I'm really as curious about people's emotional responses to this than I am questions.
Well, I think we probably share the same emotional reaction to it. But before we get into that, I just had a question that in my own mind, I wonder if maybe you have a thought that with all the slaves in this area, and probably, this area is not unique. And there were slaves that were running away all the time. But the thing that surprises me is that there was not a greater exodus and attempt to flee this slavery situation. And I'm just wondering why you think that is. I mean, I guess there was some fear that they would be caught and bad things done to them, but
Killed.
there was there a general, not a general, but was there a sense that being a slave in the right circumstance by the right owners and being taken somewhat care of was not the worst thing in the world, and so there was somewhat of an acquiescence in the condition of enslavement by some of the slaves, which explains why we didn't have this larger scale exodus?
I'm not a historian. I'll defer to Keith.
Yeah, I mean, running away was ubiquitous and all the time. And it's basically, this is a system of terror. We now sort of romanticize the spookiness of the old Charleston jail, which is just down the road from us at Archdale Street, right? But right next to that was a place called the Sugar House. And the Sugar House was not where you got your sweets, but that was where if you had a recalcitrant slave and you were not able to discipline that slave, or you were unwilling to discipline that slave, would then be treated by the city, put on treadmills, beaten, and all sorts of things. It was completely a system of terrorism. If you ran away, you ran the risk of losing your own life. And if you ran away and you were part of a family, you ran the risk of your families, putting your families at danger. I mean, it was a system of terror, nothing short of that, Ren. It's really quite difficult to get out of slavery if you're even in Charleston, right? There are amazing stories of successful escapes from slavery. People put themselves into bales of cotton and had themselves shipped to the north. There are famous cases of people who put themselves in boxes and had themselves mailed to the north. There's a guy called William Box Brown who did that. But generally, runaways had a very, very low expectation of success. And as I say, they not only risked their own lives, but they risked the lives of their families. So that's what kept the system stable. And Margaret's quite right that if you can extend the sense of who has a stake in maintaining it, then you have a greater sense of maintaining the stability. Denmark Vesey bought his own wife out of slavery, having won his own freedom through, extraordinarily enough, a lottery. But then, as an unenslaved person in 1822, what does he do? Right? He has his freedom at that time, but there's no way he's going to accept or tolerate that. He leads a rebellion, which leads, in fact, to multiple executions, again, with very, very little recourse to proper processes of law or the rest of it. In other words, if you lifted a finger against that system, you were in deep, deep trouble.
And I think there was persistence on the part of slave owners to go to the end of the world to retrieve their slaves. There's a book on George Washington, I think.
Yeah.
and a slave that was actually technically owned by his wife, Martha, but she was followed to the ends of the earth.
Yeah. No, they tracked them down. I mean, if you think about Toni Morrison's very famous book, Beloved, which is about a very famous runaway case. This was Margaret Garner, who ran away across the Ohio River from Kentucky into Ohio. This also shows you again how the federal law also supported the South, right? Because the South was always bleating, especially after the Civil War, that they'd been fighting to preserve states' rights. Well, sometimes they really liked federal law, because federal law basically said that if you were outside, if you were in a non-slave owning state, basically states' laws applied, and that anybody who was a runaway slave was still a runaway slave and still subject to the laws of the state from which that person had come. So when Margaret Garner and her family run away across the Ohio River into Ohio, they are not actually free, right? Because they are still, according to the Fugitive Slave Act, still under the jurisdiction essentially of Kentucky law. And so when the slave catchers go across the Ohio River to try and get her back for her family, for her owning the family that owns her, she famously killed one of her own children rather than have that child enslaved. And as a result, she was therefore she'd committed a murder, she'd committed infanticide in Ohio.
So I want everybody just to close your eyes for a second. Just close your eyes. And right now, you are not only a parent, you are a grandparent. This is your life on a plantation on James Island. And the owner has passed away, and now the estate is being sold. And the somewhat piece of stability that you could hang on to is now completely shattered. And you are about to go before a sale, not only yourself, but to watch your children and your grandchildren be sold. I mean, just think of your own families. I mean, put this in your own shoes. And you may have an inkling how people of African descent feel about the atrocities for centuries that they've had to endure. So I want that to stay with you.
Margaret Garner preferred to slit her own child's throat rather than let her go back into slavery. And then they wouldn't try her for murder. They simply took her back into slavery because she was still owned by that Kentucky family. And vindictively, that family then actually sold her downriver, and she finally died many years later in New Orleans.
My reaction, Margaret, is that I'm not surprised, I'm stunned, and I'm not as stunned as you would be because I don't have any that I know of direct connections, although maybe there are. But one of the comments I want to make is that there are parallels today between those kind of acts, not as severe because we have laws, but for example, there's a situation now where a lot of the children from schools are being sent to jail, and they are mostly Black children. And the conditions apparently are just awful in the county jail where these kids are kept. And there are people who are defending that. One of them is Sandy Sin, who's running for re-election in the state. She's the attorney who claims that all the conditions aren't all that bad. And then she even uses this analogy. She says, would you like to have those 17-year-olds who killed that person in downtown?
Right.
How about them? You want them sent to a country club for a prison? Now, can you imagine that people would say that and would defend the abuse of children today? It just shows that we still have people who just cannot get over the South losing the war.
Is that clear?
Hi, Margaret.
Hi, how you doing?
I had to talk with, good, thanks. I had to talk with my my daughter and granddaughter in California, and so I was a little late in checking in. My theory, which links to the Mother Emanuel AME, is that when and maybe you already talked about this, but when the plantation owners saw that they had too many slaves who could rebel, they separated the whites from the blacks, because originally my understanding was that white and black people worked together. Then what they did is they separated them by color, by skin color. And at least, even though the white was just as poor as the black, at least they were what do they call, the overseer. And I see that kind of parallel with the boy who killed the 9 at the Mother Emanuel AME church, because he said, I'm poor as a church mouse. I'm just as, poor as you, maybe just as poor as you, but I'm white, and therefore I can shoot you. Do you see where I'm going with that?
I do, and yeah. So I want to just ask one more time, and please, reach out to me. My email is margaret@margaretseidler.com. So it's first name, last name.com. If you are interested in getting involved in making a difference in Charleston, this is a difference to be made, and this is the time to make it. It's never been, in my 68 years, I don't think the time has ever been more needed than today for white people to help reveal the truth of our past.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret.
It's good to see you.
That may be the note to end on, since we already get to 10:50. It is, this is something which is absolutely ubiquitous. It's every single street you walk down, the street names we pay no attention to. Margaret, you were talking about the fact that you'd been surrounded by this for many, many years, but just simply weren't conscious of it. All the street names, all the building names, all the county names, Lawrence, Aiken, those guys are slave owners, they're slave traders. We are absolutely drenched in the blood of this system here. And we really do have to understand it in order to understand, as Mike and others have pointed out, that its legacy is still here.
Yes, and let me just make one more point, and that is to understand that enslaving people was not just the Legrees and the Ravenels and the Tons. It is everywhere, house everywhere. That's all we really learned about was plantations. I'm telling you, what was going on in was much bigger than what was going on in the plantations. It's unbelievable.
Yes, well, thank you, Margaret. And thank you very much, everybody. And we'll be back on again next week at 10 o'clock. And unfortunately, this has blown my mind, and I've completely forgotten what the next one is, because it's got me too exercised as usual. But please do follow up on all of these hints that Margaret's given us, looking at Larry Koga, all sorts of other wonderful history books where the stuff is available. But too often we do look at it with a blind eye. We don't pay attention. So thank you again, Margaret. Wonderful presentation. Thanks, everybody else.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you.
Very good. Wonderful.
Thank you, Margaret. That really was absolutely terrific.
Thank you. Could you send me Christy Landis's email? I don't think I have it. I've got an idea to do something with her.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'd be very happy to do that. And again, thanks very much, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.